I never thought my life would change with a single letter. People say that sort of thing in books and movies, but it always sounded so dramatic, so far-fetched, so unlike the slow and steady world I had built for myself in Vermont. But that's exactly how it happened to me. One day, my world was a patchwork of routines and small comforts, and the next, everything I knew tilted on its axis. It was late October, and the first hints of winter were already in the air. The leaves were mostly gone from the maples outside my second-story window, and the cold wind that came off Lake Champlain made the old glass panes rattle in their frames. My apartment was nothing special, but it was mine. I'd filled it with plants and books, thrift store armchairs, and old postcards pinned up like tiny flags of memory. I worked at the Riverbend bookstore downtown, a cozy, cramped space wedged between a bakery and a bike shop on Church Street in Burlington, Vermont. I liked the slow rhythm of my days, opening boxes of new releases, shelving old favorites, making coffee for regulars, and more than anything, going home at night to the silence of my little apartment. That afternoon, I came home after a long shift. My feet ached from standing at the register, and my hands were stained with newsprint from unpacking boxes of books. There was the usual pile of junk mail on the rug by the door, local pizza coupons, an electricity bill, a glossy flyer for a yoga studio. But sitting neatly atop the pile was an envelope that made me stop in my tracks. My name, Aiden Margaret West, was written across the front in a careful, looping script I recognized instantly. My grandfather's handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He'd been gone for 3 months, but seeing his handwriting, even on something as mundane as an envelope, brought him back in a rush of memory. The warmth of his hug, the way he whistled as he worked in the garden, the smell of pipe tobacco and pine needles. The envelope was heavy, thick, the kind you only buy for important occasions. My hands shook as I picked it up and carried it to the kitchen. The sun was already dipping behind the hills, and the apartment was washed in that golden blue light that makes everything feel both fragile and permanent. I sat at the table, surrounded by a week's worth of coffee mugs and a stray sock I kept forgetting to wash, and stared at the letter. I don't know how long I sat there, turning the envelope over in my hands. Finally, I took a deep breath and slid it open with a butter knife. Inside was a stack of papers, neatly folded, with a note from my grandfather on top. His voice echoed in my mind as I read his words. Gentle, steady, full of love and a little bit of teasing, as always. My dear Aiden, he'd written, if you're reading this, it means I've gone to wherever old men go when they're finished with this world. Don't worry, I'm not far. I'm probably sitting under the apple tree in the backyard, watching you read this letter. Take a breath. I need you to be brave, just for a little while longer. He went on to explain what I already suspected, deep down. My grandparents had left me everything. The house in Vermont, the small amount of money they'd saved over a lifetime, and the old coin collection that my grandfather had loved. The will was clear. Everything was in my name. There were no caveats, no if or unless. It was mine. I sat back in the kitchen chair, the letter trembling in my hands. I could smell the faint trace of my grandfather's aftershave. Or maybe it was just memory playing tricks. All I could think was how much I missed him, and how utterly unprepared I felt for this new responsibility. I wasn't the sort of person who inherited estates or made big decisions. I was the quiet one, the one who kept her head down and tried not to make waves. I'd always been the good granddaughter, the one who visited on Sundays, brought groceries when Grandpa's back went out, and sat by the window with Grandma when she wanted to talk about the old days in Europe before she'd come to America. I was the listener in a family of talkers. Now suddenly, I was at the center of everything. After the shock began to settle, reality started creeping in, whispering all the ways this could go wrong. The house in the hills of Vermont was old, sprawling, and beautiful in a way that only houses built a century ago could be. I'd spent so many weekends there as a kid, exploring the attic, reading on the wide front porch, picking blueberries behind the shed. The land itself was worth a small fortune, not to mention the antique furniture, the collection of rare books, and the savings account I had no idea even existed. And then, inevitably, my thoughts turned to my family, my brother Tyler and my mother, Helen. I could practically hear the phone calls, the arguments, the guilt trips forming before they even knew what had happened. Tyler was older by 2 years, and for as long as I could remember, he'd been the golden child, at least, in his mind. He was always chasing the next big thing, the next dollar, always convinced he deserved more than he'd been given. He'd moved to New York City straight out of college and never looked back, jumping from one job to another. Real estate, tech startups, a stint at a hedge fund that ended in disaster. Whenever we talked, which wasn't often, he had a way of making me feel like my quiet life in Vermont was a failure, that I was wasting my potential. He measured everything in money, in status, in what he could show off at Thanksgiving dinners, my aim. Mother Helen was even more complicated. She lived in Boston, and she'd never quite forgiven me for choosing the slow, small-town life over the hustle and promise of the city. She was sharp-tongued, quick to judge, and never satisfied with anything that wasn't hers. I knew that when she found out about the inheritance, she'd see it as a personal insult. She'd find a way to blame me for it, to make me the villain, in a story where all I'd done was be loved by my grandparents. Sitting there in my kitchen, I felt the old, familiar wave of dread rising in my chest. I could already picture the phone calls, Tyler's smooth voice trying to charm me into sharing the wealth, Mom's emails dripping with passive-aggressive concern for my well-being. The thought of it was enough to make me want to run away, to throw the letter in a drawer and pretend it never existed. But then I thought of my grandparents, their quiet faith in me, the way they had always seen the best in me, even when I couldn't see it in myself. They had chosen me, trusted me, given me the chance to build something new from what they'd left behind. I owed it to them and to myself to do this right. The first thing I did was call their old lawyer, Margaret Bellamy, in Montpelier. She'd handled their affairs for decades, and I remembered her from childhood, always impeccably dressed, with a sharp mind and a soft voice that put even the most anxious client at ease. I made an appointment for the next morning, barely sleeping. That night, as my mind raced with possibilities and fears. The next day, I drove down winding roads, past fields already dusted with frost, into the heart of Montpelier. The city was quiet that morning. The streets lined with brick buildings and little shops still shuttered against the cold. I found Margaret's office above a bakery, the air inside warm and smelling of cinnamon. She greeted me with a firm handshake and a kind smile. And as soon as I sat down, I felt a little bit of the burden lift. We went through the paperwork together, and she explained everything in language I could understand, not the legalese that made my eyes glaze over. The will was ironclad, she assured me. My grandparents had made sure there were no loopholes, no way for anyone to contest it without looking foolish. The house, the savings, everything was mine, free and clear. Still, Margaret recommended putting everything into a trust, a step I hadn't even considered. You'd be surprised how many families fall apart over something like this, she said, her eyes kind but knowing. It's better to be safe. She explained the process, and I agreed immediately. We set up the West Family Trust, naming me as the sole trustee. Every asset, the house, the land, the savings, even my grandfather's prized coin collection, was placed into the trust, legally protected from any outside claims. I paid Margaret $5,000 for her services, money that came straight from my own savings account. I hesitated for a moment as I handed over the check, thinking of how many hours I'd worked to earn that money, but I knew it was worth it. In that moment, I understood for the first time how quickly things could go wrong if I wasn't careful. When I left the lawyer's office, the weight of everything finally hit me. I drove up to the old house on Fern Hill, just outside Montpelier. The driveway was covered in leaves, and the windows looked cold and empty without the warm glow of my grandparents inside. I stood at the edge of the porch, the key heavy in my hand, and looked up at the sky. Clouds were rolling in, gray and low, and I felt both scared and grateful all at once. I walked through the empty rooms, each one filled with memories. The piano in the parlor where Grandma had played old folk songs from Europe, the kitchen where Grandpa made pancakes every Sunday, the dusty attic stuffed with trunks and photo albums. I could almost hear their voices, feel their presence in every creak of the floorboards. That night, I slept in my old bedroom, wrapped in a quilt my grandmother had made when I was a child. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, I felt chosen, trusted, and seen. But I also knew, deep down, that the storm was coming. My family would find out soon enough. Tyler, with his easy smile and restless ambition. Mom, with her sharp words and endless expectations. They would come for what they thought was theirs. They always did. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a silent promise to myself and my grandparents. I would protect what they had given me. I would honor their trust, no matter what it cost me. I didn't know yet how hard that would be, or how far I'd have to go, but I knew one thing for certain: my life would never be the same. And as I lay there in the quiet Vermont night, surrounded by memories and the ghosts of those who loved me best, I felt something new taking root inside me. A quiet, fierce determination that, for once, I would not let anyone else write my story. The days that followed my move into the old house on Fern Hill blurred together in a kind of chilly, golden haze. Vermont in November was neither summer's riot of color nor the snowbound silence of deep winter. It was a world of grays and browns and the occasional cold sunlight that slipped through the naked trees. Every morning, I woke to the sound of the wind shaking the window panes, the dull ache of loss in my chest, and the overwhelming list of things that needed to be done. The house, of course, was beautiful, but it was also ancient and uncooperative. My grandparents had kept it in as good a condition as they could, but there were limits to what two people in their 80s could manage. The roof over the kitchen sagged in one corner, the radiators clanked and moaned through the night, and the plumbing was a maze of old pipes with secrets of their own. I learned the peculiarities of the house as I went: which floorboards would groan underfoot, which windows stuck in their frames, which steps creaked no matter how lightly I walked. The first real challenge came with a leak in the kitchen ceiling, right above the old wooden breakfast table. I discovered it one morning after a heavy rain, a slow, insistent drip that pattered into a mixing bowl I'd left out. I stood for a while, just watching it, as if maybe the leak would fix itself if I glared hard enough. Of course, it didn't. My hands were soon streaked with dust and plaster as I tried, clumsily, to patch it up. It was messy work, and not entirely successful. I ended up with more water on the floor than I started with, and a growing sense that I might have bitten off more than I could chew. I'd just finished clearing up when the doorbell rang, cutting through the silence of the house. The sound startled me, echoing through the empty hallway and making me realize how quiet things had been since I'd moved in. For a moment, I just stood there, dust rag in hand, heart racing in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. The lawyer had said she'd call before stopping by, and the neighbors had mostly kept their distance, polite but reserved. The only people who might show up unannounced were family, and I knew in my gut that my peace was about to be shattered. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked to the door, pausing for a second to compose myself. I tried to prepare for anything, but nothing could have readied me for the sight of my brother, Tyler, standing on the porch, suitcase in hand, a grin stretched wide across his face. He looked exactly as he always had, tall, handsome in a way that seemed effortless, his blonde hair swept back, his blue eyes quick and calculating. Tyler had always been able to charm anyone he met, and he knew it. But as I looked at him, I realized that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something sharp and hungry in his gaze, something that set me instantly on edge. "Aiden!" he called out, arms spread wide as if this were some kind of homecoming. "Look at you, God, it's good to see you." Before I could say a word, he pulled me into a hug, squeezing a little too tight, his hand patting my back in a way that felt more like a search for hidden pockets than an expression of affection. I stepped back, forcing a smile. "Hey, Tyler. This is a surprise." He shrugged as if it were nothing. "I figured you could use some company out here. Plus, we have a lot to talk about." His eyes flickered past me into the dim hallway, taking in the stacks of boxes, the dust, motes in the sunlight, the general sense of upheaval. For a moment, I was tempted to ask how he'd known where I was, but I already knew the answer. News traveled fast in our family, especially when it involved money or property. Tyler had probably gotten wind of the inheritance the moment the will was read. Stepped aside and let him in, out of habit more than anything else. He set his suitcase down just inside the door and immediately began a running commentary on the house. How big it was, how much work it looked like, how expensive it must be to heat. I tried not to let his words get to me, but it was like having a radio turned on too loud, every note of criticism echoing through rooms that still felt sacred. We ended up in the kitchen, where the leak had left a damp ring on the ceiling. Tyler glanced up and grinned. Old houses, right? They're beautiful, but they eat money. Good thing you've got some now, huh? I ignored the jab and started making tea, partly for something to do with my hands, partly to give myself an excuse to turn my back on him for a moment. The kettle whistled, sharp and shrill, as I lined up mismatched mugs on the counter. So, how long are you planning to stay? I asked, keeping my tone light. He spread his hands innocently. Oh, just until Mom gets here. She's driving up tomorrow. Said she wants to help you settle in. She's got some ideas. The way he said it made my stomach twist. Some ideas was never good news, not from Mom. It always meant plans and expectations and 1,000 small ways she'd try to shape my life to fit her vision of how things ought to be. Tyler helped himself to a mug and leaned against the counter, watching me with a sort of idle curiosity. So, what's the plan, Aiden? You gonna keep this place all to yourself, or? I busied myself with pouring the tea, pretending not to hear the question. I haven't decided yet. There's a lot to sort through. He laughed, a low, easy sound, but there was an edge to it. Come on, sis. It's a big house for one person. You could sell it, make a killing, or rent it out. Hell, I know some guys in real estate in New York who'd snap this up in a heartbeat. A place like this, close to the ski towns, it's prime property. I shrugged, not looking at him. I'm not selling. At least not right now. This was Grandpa and Grandma's house. I want to take my time. He rolled his eyes but said nothing. We sipped our tea in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the drip of the faucet and the faint ticking of the old wall clock. That night, I barely slept. After Tyler went to bed in the guest room, formerly my grandfather's study, I sat at the kitchen table and went through the trust documents again. Every page, every signature. I double-checked the deed, the statements, and the receipts for every expense. I kept my lawyer's number on speed dial and made a copy of every important paper, hiding them in a folder in my bedroom closet. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I was going to need them. I tried to quiet my mind by reading, but the words blurred together on the page. I wandered the halls in my pajamas, pausing to look at the family photographs still hung on the walls. My grandparents on their wedding day, my mother and uncle as children, Tyler and me as toddlers playing in the yard. The house was filled with echoes, and I wondered not for the first time what they would make of the tension now simmering within its walls. The next morning dawned gray and cold. I found Tyler in the study, the door slightly ajar. He was rifling through drawers, papers, and old photographs scattered on the floor around him. He looked up, startled, when I appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He grinned, unbothered. "Looking for my old baseball cards. Remember those? I think I left them here years ago. It could be worth something now." I didn't believe him, not for a second. Tyler had never cared about baseball, and the cards he owned as a kid were worth more to my grandparents than to him. Still, I let it go. Picking a fight now would only make things worse. "I'll help you look later," I said, turning to leave. "I've got some errands to run in town." By midday, the house was filled with the scent of cleaning supplies, and the distant sound of Tyler's music, played too loud from his phone. I tried to focus on scrubbing the kitchen floor, anything to keep my mind from spiraling into anxiety. I could hear my phone buzzing on the counter with messages from Mom, updates about her ETA, reminders to pick up extra groceries, complaints about the traffic out of Boston. She arrived late in the afternoon, her car crunching up the gravel driveway, a plume of dust trailing behind her. I watched from the window as she climbed out, wrapped in a tailored gray coat, her hair perfectly styled despite the long drive. She swept up the porch steps with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged everywhere she went. The door swung open before I could reach it. Mom strode into the foyer, pausing only to take in the high ceilings and worn hardwood floors. "Aiden," she said, leaning in for a quick, perfunctory hug. She smelled of expensive perfume and winter air. You look tired. Are you sleeping? Enough? I opened my mouth to answer, but she was already moving on, her gaze darting around the house, taking in every detail, every imperfection. God, this place is enormous. How are you managing all this by yourself? She dropped her purse on the hall table, shrugged out of her coat, and handed it to me as if I were the hired help. I'm doing fine, I replied, struggling not to sound defensive. I've been fixing things up bit by bit. She made a face, as if the idea of me handling anything practical was absurd. Well, you don't have to do it alone. That's why I'm here. We can make a plan. She breezed through the house, Tyler trailing after her, both of them talking over each other with suggestions and questions. Shouldn't I get the roof inspected by a professional? Wasn't it dangerous to be here by myself? Had I considered how much it would cost to keep the place heated through the winter? Did I know what the taxes would be like now that the property was solely in my name? Every question felt less like concern and more like a subtle accusation, a reminder that, in their eyes, I was not equipped to handle this on my own. They found their way into the living room, where the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, turning the dust motes to gold. Mom perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture perfect, her eyes sharp. Listen, Aiden, she began, her tone brisk. You're not going to keep this place all to yourself, are you? It's too much for one person. You're not even good at handling money. No offense, but I know how much you struggled after college. This is a big responsibility. She paused, letting her words settle like a weight in the room. I've been thinking, she continued. It would be best if I helped you manage the estate. Just until you get your feet under you. I've done all the paperwork before. You know I'm good with numbers. If you give me power of attorney, I can handle the bills, the taxes, and the legal stuff. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing, Tyler. Nodded enthusiastically, as if this were the most reasonable plan in the world. I felt a rush of anger, hot and sudden, but I kept my expression neutral. I appreciate your concern, Mom, I said, choosing my words carefully. But I've already hired a lawyer. Everything's in a trust. I've got it under control. She raised an eyebrow, a small dismissive smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. A lawyer? Those people will bleed you dry, Aiden. Family looks out for family. I'll think about it, I said, forcing a polite smile. Inside, my mind was racing. I knew what this was, an attempt to get a foot in the door, to take control of something that was never meant to be hers. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talk, passive-aggressive comments, and a mounting sense of dread. As night fell, I escaped to my bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint sounds of Tyler and Mom talking downstairs, their voices low and conspiratorial. I looked around the room at the familiar quilt, the old photographs, the shadows cast by the moonlight on the wall. I knew with absolute certainty that the fight was just beginning. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable child they remembered. I was the keeper of my grandparents' legacy, and I would not let it slip away, not without a fight. As I drifted off to sleep, I clung to that promise, determined to stand my ground, no matter what the days ahead would bring. If anyone had asked me a year ago what the worst kind of family drama looked like, I would have thought of tense holiday dinners or uncomfortable silences over the phone. I never imagined the day would come when I'd be standing on the porch of my grandparents' house, facing down my brother and a pair of strangers he'd hired, with the future of everything I'd inherited hanging in the balance. After my mother and Tyler's initial visit, I knew they weren't going to back off easily. The next few days were tense but quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My mother returned to Boston with promises to call about some business matters, and Tyler vanished back to New York, leaving behind a trail of empty coffee mugs and a not-so-subtle warning that we'd be talking soon. I tried to throw myself into repairs, losing myself in small victories, patching a wall here, clearing out a closet there, but the sense of impending conflict clung to me like the damp Vermont air. I should have known it would escalate fast. It always did with Tyler. What I didn't expect was just how quickly everything would come to a head, and how far my own family would go in the name of getting what they thought they deserved. It was early Saturday morning when I heard the truck rumbling up the gravel driveway. I was halfway through making pancakes, one of the few rituals I'd managed to keep alive from when Grandpa was still here. The sky outside was a blank sheet of gray, the kind that threatened snow but never quite delivered. I glanced through the kitchen window and felt my heart drop straight into my stomach. A moving truck, the kind you rent by the day, was pulling in. Tyler's dark blue sedan was right behind, and two men in work boots and canvas jackets jumped out, stretching and laughing as if this were just another job. Tyler followed, dressed in a way he thought made him look important. Pressed shirt, tailored slacks, sunglasses despite the weather. I went to the front door, bracing myself. I could hear them talking and laughing as they approached the porch. Tyler's voice, always too loud, cut through the quiet like a knife. "Aiden!" he called out, grinning as if he'd just dropped by for coffee. "Good morning. I brought some help. Thought we could finally start sorting this place out." He didn't wait for me to answer. He waved the two men forward, and they started, up the porch steps with heavy boots and determined faces. One of them gave me a polite nod. The other just stared at his shoes. "Hold on," I said, stepping in front of the door, heart pounding in my chest. "What's going on?" Tyler pulled a manila envelope from his bag and waved it in my face. "I've got paperwork. Everything's sorted. Mom and I talked to a new lawyer. She found a loophole in the will. It turns out the estate should have gone to both of us, not just you. This house, all the assets, it's a shared inheritance. We're just getting ahead of the official transfer." He handed me a stack of papers. My hands shook as I took them, but even before I started reading, I could see the flaws. The signatures looked nothing like the ones I'd seen on the real documents. The notary stamp was crooked, and there was no official county seal, just a blurry photocopy of something that might have been from a business card. It was the kind of forgery you'd expect from someone who watched too many crime dramas and thought they could bluff their way through anything. I looked up at Tyler, who was busy directing the movers to start with the living room. I held the papers out to him. "This is a joke, right? You expect me to believe these are real?" He shrugged, that smug smile never leaving his face. "It doesn't matter what you believe, Aiden. The movers have orders, and I'm not leaving until this place is cleared out. You can call your lawyer if you want, but I think we both know that's a waste of time. The law's on our side." The men started to move past me, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to cross the guy paying their fee. I planted myself in the doorway and raised my voice. "Nobody's moving anything until I say so. This is my house. The trust is legal and binding. If you don't stop now, I'll call the sheriff." Tyler's face darkened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "You're not going to call anyone, you never do. You just roll over and let people walk all over you. That's what you've always done." I felt something shift inside me then, a steeliness I didn't know I had. I pulled out my phone and dialed Margaret Bellamy's number. She answered on the first ring, and as soon as I explained the situation, her calm professionalism kicked in. "Don't let them move a thing," she said. "I'll contact the county clerk's office and send someone over. Keep them outside if you can." I hung up, turned to Tyler, and said, "The lawyer's on her way, so are county officials. If you don't leave now, you'll be explaining yourself to the authorities." For a moment, I thought he might back down. He hesitated, his eyes darting from me to the movers and back. Then, just as quickly, his old arrogance returned. "Fine," he snapped. "Let's wait. But you're going to regret making this harder than it needs to be." The next hour crawled by. The movers, sensing trouble, hung back on the porch, smoking cigarettes and pretending not to listen to our argument. Tyler paced the living room, muttering under his breath and texting furiously. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, watching the clock. It wasn't long before I heard another car crunching up the driveway. A county official in a crisp jacket stepped out, followed closely by Margaret. Their presence filled me with relief. Tyler's bravado faded the second they walked in. Margaret took one look at the forged documents and let out a long, exasperated sigh. She turned to Tyler. "These aren't worth the paper they're printed on. You do realize this is a felony, don't you?" The official was even less amused. He examined the papers, compared them with the originals I'd brought, and shook his head. "There's no legal transfer. The trust is valid. If you don't leave the premises now, I'll have to involve law enforcement." Tyler's face went from red to white in a matter of seconds. He tried to bluster, claiming he was just looking out for family interests, but nobody was buying it. The movers, realizing they'd been hired under pretenses, quickly packed up their truck and left without another word. Then my mother stormed in, her face set in a mask of fury. She started yelling before she was even fully inside. "Aiden, how could you do this? You're tearing the family apart. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I tried to explain, to remind her that the will was clear, that Grandma and Grandpa had chosen me for a reason, but she wouldn't listen. She kept shouting, her voice rising with every accusation. She threatened to sue, to drag my name through the mud, to make sure everyone knew how selfish and ungrateful I was. Margaret stepped in, her calm authority cutting through the chaos. "You're welcome to contest the will in court," she said to my mother. "But I'll warn you now, you have no case. And if you continue this harassment, we'll be forced to take legal action." The confrontation left me shaking. I watched as Tyler and my mother retreated, their plans unraveling before their eyes. Tyler slammed the car door so hard the window rattled. My mother paused on the porch, glaring at me as if she could set the house on fire with her eyes alone. "You'll regret this, Aiden," she spat. "You'll regret choosing that house over your own family." When they were gone, I sat down on the front steps and let myself cry for the first time since all this started. Not because I regretted what I'd done, but because the people who were supposed to love me most had tried to take everything from me and failed. But the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. My mother immediately launched a campaign, calling every cousin, every family friend, every distant relative in America and Europe who might listen. The phone started ringing off the hook. Some of the messages were concerned, others were cold and accusing. I heard through the grapevine that my mother was telling everyone I had cheated her and Tyler out of their birthright, that I'd manipulated Grandpa and Grandma in their old age. She spun tales of betrayal and greed, painting herself as the victim and me as the heartless villain. It was painful to know that people I'd grown up with, who'd eaten at our holiday table and played in the yard with Tyler and me as kids, were now taking sides, or worse, just gossiping about me behind my back. Some aunts and uncles sent terse emails asking for my side of the story, but most just stayed silent, preferring not to get involved. It was as if the entire family had split along invisible fault lines, and I was left standing alone on my island. But the worst was yet to come. Tyler, desperate and reckless, tried to use the forged documents to secure a loan in New York. He'd gotten involved with a tech startup after college, one of those places that promised the world but delivered nothing but debt and stress. When the bank did its due diligence, the fraud became obvious. Suddenly, Tyler was facing criminal charges. The story spread quickly. He'd lost his job, his reputation in shambles, his friends abandoning him one by one. I found out about it not from Tyler himself, but from Margaret, who called to warn me that his legal troubles might affect the ongoing drama with the estate. I felt a complicated tangle of emotions: anger, pity, even a flicker of sadness for the brother I once idolized. But mostly, I felt relief. For the first time since this started, I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew I'd done everything right. I'd honored my grandparents' wishes, protected the house, and stood my ground. In the weeks that followed, the storm slowly began to pass. My mother's campaign lost steam as more and more relatives saw through her lies. Tyler, facing real consequences for the first time in his life, retreated into silence. I threw myself into the work of restoring the house, fixing what I could, and learning to let go of what I couldn't. The legal battle faded into memory, leaving me stronger, more certain of who I was and what I wanted. The house on Fern Hill became my sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe. I planted new flowers in the garden, opened the windows to the spring air, and invited friends over for dinner. For the first time in years, I felt free, not because I'd won some grand victory, but because I'd chosen to fight for myself, for my future, and for the legacy my grandparents had entrusted to me. And that, in the end, was worth every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. When the dust finally settled over Fern Hill, what struck me most wasn't the silence, but the quality of it. Silence used to feel like loneliness. Now, for the first time, it sounded like freedom. After the chaos of lawyers, accusations, slammed doors, and family betrayal, the house seemed to sigh along with me, grateful for the quiet. I spent those first few weeks in a kind of stunned recovery, almost as if I were convalescing after an illness. The exhaustion was more emotional than physical, but it was no less real. The rooms echoed with memories, my grandparents' laughter at the kitchen table, the shuffle of my mother's high heels on the entryway tile, even Tyler's careless jokes drifting down the hallways from when we were children. For a while, every sound seemed sharper and more poignant. It was as if the house, too, was grieving for a family that had fractured beyond repair. But gradually, as the days stretched on and spring melted the last patches of Vermont snow, I started to rediscover something I'd lost, a sense of belonging, not just to the house, but to myself. Each morning began with coffee in the sunroom, a ritual I'd inherited from my grandfather. The room faced east, catching the first pink light of day through its tall, slightly wavy windows. I'd wrap myself in an old flannel robe, open the paper, and let the warmth soak into my skin as I listened to the soft chorus of birds waking up in the maple trees. Some days, I would sit for an hour, watching squirrels chase each other across the fence or just letting my thoughts wander without pressure or fear. It was strange at first to have so much time and space to myself. For so long, my life had been shaped by other people's needs. Customers at the bookstore, my grandparents' gentle requests, my mother's demands, Tyler's endless expectations. I'd learned to quiet myself, to avoid conflict, to smooth over the edges of other people's anger with my silence. I never realized how much of my life had been dictated by the need to keep peace. Now there was only my voice, quiet but insistent, asking, "What do you want?" The first answer, I realized, was healing. The house was full of little wounds, cracks in the plaster, peeling paint, windows that let in cold drafts and memories in equal measure. I took to my repair projects with a kind of gentle patience, never rushing, never demanding more of myself than I could give in a day. I patched the roof over the kitchen, learning as I went from YouTube videos and the helpful advice of an elderly neighbor named June, who brought over cookies and stories about her battles with leaking roofs. Most weekends, I worked in the garden. The earth was dark and rich, still holding the promise of my grandmother's care. I found her gardening tools hanging in the shed, each one cleaned and oiled, neatly labeled in her careful script. With each weed I pulled, each row I dug, I felt her presence beside me, not as a ghost, but as a steady encouragement in my bones. I planted tomatoes, carrots, wildflowers, and rows of sunflowers along the back fence, their faces always turned toward the sun. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a battleground and more like a home. I hung new curtains in the parlor, patched up the rickety back steps, and even started repainting the shutters a soft, welcoming blue. There were still moments of doubt, nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd done the right thing, if I'd ruined the last threads of my family for the sake of a house. But those nights grew fewer as the seasons changed. Sometimes, in the quiet, my mind would drift back to Tyler and my mother. I'd think of the last words we'd exchanged, all sharp, edges and hurt, and feel a deep, complicated ache. My mother still sent emails every month or two, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes an odd mix of both. She'd accuse me of greed or of forgetting where I came from. She'd demand her share of the inheritance, usually attaching a scanned letter from some lawyer she'd convinced to take her side. At first, I felt compelled to respond, to defend myself, to explain the unexplainable. But I soon realized there was nothing I could say that would change her story in her mind. Tyler, on the other hand, disappeared from my life almost completely. After his arrest for fraud, he seemed to vanish into the folds of New York's endless cityscape. Once or twice, he sent short, bitter texts about family loyalty or the price of betrayal. Eventually, even those stopped coming. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he'd taken a job in London, trying to rebuild his reputation across the Atlantic. I wondered if he missed the life we'd shared as children, or if he thought of me at all now, or if he was only running from the consequences of his actions. The family, such as it was, splintered further. Some cousins believed my mother's version of the story, painting me as a cold-hearted usurper. Others reached out quietly, sending notes of sympathy or sharing their tales of family strife. A few simply faded away, choosing the easier path of silence over the messy business of choosing sides. It hurt, losing those connections, but I began to see that some ties were only as strong as the secrets we kept. When the truth finally emerged, only what was real remained. Despite the heartache, there was relief in the separation. The drama, the pressure, the feeling that I was always disappointing someone, it faded, replaced by a sense of agency I'd never known before. The trust my grandparents had set up, now worth nearly $400,000 after years of careful investing, gave me breathing room. I didn't need to worry about paying the heating bill or fixing the roof. I could choose work that mattered to me, not just work that paid the rent. For the first time, I had the space to consider what I wanted out of life. I started volunteering at the local library in town, running story hours for children and helping seniors navigate the computer lab. The director, a sharp-witted woman named Pauline, became a friend. We'd trade book recommendations, and sometimes, over lunch, I'd tell her stories about my grandparents, about the legacy they'd left and the battles I'd fought to protect it. She'd listen, nodding, and then gently steer the conversation toward books, the future, things I could shape and control. There were days when the old anxiety returned, usually when the mail brought another legal notice, or when I heard from relatives who couldn't understand my choices. But more and more, I learned to set those worries aside. I'd take long walks through the woods behind the house, following the deer paths my grandfather had once shown me. Sometimes I'd pause by the old apple tree at the edge of the property, pressing my palm against its rough bark, remembering the promise I'd made to myself to honor what I'd been given. My world grew wider, not smaller, with each act of letting go. I traveled to Boston for a weekend, visiting museums and sipping coffee in little bookstores, no longer afraid of running into my mother or being pulled back into her orbit. I donated to causes I believed in: literacy programs, wildlife, conservation, women's shelters, knowing that my money could make a difference in lives far beyond my own. Giving, I found, brought a lightness to my spirit that all the money in the world couldn't buy. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'd invite friends over for dinner. The old dining table, scarred and nicked by decades of family meals, came alive, again with laughter and conversation. We'd linger over homemade bread and slow-cooked stews, candles flickering in the soft lamplight, the house echoing with voices that felt like home. In those moments, I realized that family could be chosen as much as inherited, that healing could come from new bonds as well as old. The journey to self-worth wasn't linear. I still had moments when I questioned myself, when guilt or sadness threatened to drag me back into old patterns. But I started to see those moments as weather, temporary, passing, something to be acknowledged but not obeyed. I learned to forgive myself for needing boundaries, for choosing peace over chaos, for daring to put myself first. There was one afternoon, late in the summer, when I stood at the edge of the garden, sunflowers nodding in the breeze, and felt a kind of joy I'd never known before. It was quiet and unremarkable, just the hum of bees, the warmth of the sun, the distant sound of children playing at the neighbor's house. But in that moment, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't fighting anymore. I wasn't running. I was simply living. My grandparents' house had become a place of safety, not a prize to be won or a burden to bear. Every floorboard, every window, every stubborn patch of wild violets in the yard was a testament to their love, and finally, to mine for myself. The trust fund remained, not just as a financial cushion, but as a symbol of their faith in me. I knew now that they hadn't chosen me out of obligation or convenience, but because they saw something in me I was only just learning to see in myself. In the end, it wasn't about the house, or the money, or even the family name. It was about knowing my worth, about protecting what mattered to me, about believing that I deserved happiness and peace. For once, I chose myself. The quiet that filled Fern Hill was no longer an emptiness, but a fullness. The sound of a life, rebuilt from the inside out, a freedom hard-won and fiercely protected. And every morning as I watched the sun rise over the Vermont hills, I knew deep in my bones that I was exactly where I was meant to be, and that to me is freedom.